through a few works of which during my undergraduate years have been all at once informative, enlightening, and deeply unsettling. At several points I'll take brief asides, some seemingly arbitrary, and others deliberate and precise, referring to and even reciting what I've deemed the most formative and formidable of these works. Acento is also widely known as patchwork poetry, or collage poetry. In this form, a poet takes lines directly from existing poems, books, and articles and weaves them together to create a completely new, cohesive piece. The primary goal is to make these borrowed fragments work in conversation, and as I see it, to subsequently birth a sort of ill-defined personality of its own. That said, I'd categorize my words tonight and what I've stitched and compiled as being of a similar, inclusive, and deeply personal nature. Studying English and philosophy comes with a myriad of questions, polite with only a hint of cynicism, all of which by this point I've heard enough times to nail down my most appropriate responses, at least those that will to a degree satisfy the much appreciated social concern with just enough sarcasm to keep my eye rolls at bay. What do you plan on doing with your degree? Do you have really good grammar? What's your favorite book? I don't really much mind this last one. If nothing else, this provides me with the opportunity to speak on some of the truly marvelous readings that I've been assigned over the last few years. Taking a stab at the classics, half so on account of their genuine preeminence, and the other for the sake of telling my grandmother that I'm giving her a run for her money. I read many phenomenal essays on Marxism, Caesarean linguistics, Derrida, and deconstruction. These, of course, grossly elevated my analytic sights and my academic writing, as well as providing me with enough verbose vocabulary to prove to my mother once and for all that when angry, there are in fact many English words beyond up, fuck, and shut the. I'd been deeply moved by many of these materials, so many such that I'd be kidding myself to try and remember them all. Timeless works like East of Eden, Frankenstein, The Brothers Kay, Notes from the Underground, dense but, really, really staple readings. I'd learned to love great poetry, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Elizabeth Bishop, and many contemporary writers that I'd even had the pleasure of meeting and introducing. Briefly on that note of poetry, I learned so much as to the structural dimensions that a poet can craft, like theme, narrative, psychology, all within a few signs and symbols, but crucially, the most notable takeaway for having studied these kind of lyrical mechanics is that poetry is in fact just as weird and confusing as everybody thinks. In addition to the classics of novels and short stories, I also took to some of the more provocative and, dare I say, perverse writings, Marx's Capitals, Freudian Psychoanalytics, Nabokov's Lolita, the Epstein Files, and my personal favorite work of fiction, the Old Testament. Another question that people reproach me with often, Luke, I'm certain you encountered all varieties of this one, is what did you learn in college? It's a bit reductive, but oddly precise when it comes down to it. See, I suppose that's the point. What did I learn in college? And there's a meaningful tension, as I see it, between the question and the process by which it's experienced. I'm sure many of my peers would agree so much of what it means to learn is to lose, to forget. It's a catharsis, which don't be smitten by the kind of more modern and romantic applications of this word. Aristotle, ascribing this word to the effects of Greek tragedies, presents catharsis as a paradox of pleasure and understanding, aroused by what is ugly and repellent. It is a purging, a cleansing. But despite the conventional uses of this word, Aristotle deemed it not of a spiritual kind, but of an intellectual sort. So much of what what it was to learn in college was not a congenial undertaking, but in many respects a distinctly negative experience. Having to expel, extirpate, simply put, all the shit I'd cluttered in my understandings of the world and of my life was not such a pleasant, let alone linear process. From Chiron's The Short History of Decay, chaos is rejecting all you have learned. Chaos is being yourself. So, having been divested of the glorious enema that was my undergraduate education, I can now sift through some of the excrement and perhaps deliberate on what it is I have learned. I should say that authors, journalists, and other literary professionals, they do hate cliches. It doesn't always seem like it when you read, but I assure you we try to avoid them at all costs. So, naturally, The subject I'll be discussing for this matter is the meaning of life. Progressive, I know. As not only a writer, but also an aspiring philosopher, this, of course, is the issue of existentialism. What it is to exist, and why it is so. From Albert Camus, judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. These are facts the heart can feel, yet they call for careful study before they become clear to the intellect. I'd always been troubled by this issue. Even as a little boy, I'd perhaps, though not knowingly, come dangerously close to the margins of this great question, contemplating my own morality and consciousness. All the standard thought experiments of an 11-year-old. But it is quite simple. In essence, I wanted, and I still do, to understand. To reconcile many of the discordant meanings and conditions of my life and the lives around me. From a personal statement draft of mine, I think it all started when Macy died. I remember seeing my mom sprawled out in the grass. She just stayed there, crying for a long time. She wouldn't lift her head at all, though, so the tears didn't come out quite right. Just these grim noises, like she was dying. It sounded like she was dying. I remember that night I ran over to the parking lot, the one I used to take Macy during our walks. I ran around that place almost all night, listening to music, daydreaming, trying to make sense of it all, trying to understand. And I never did. Further on in the essay, describing a rather strange moment, I left for UT and said goodbye to my partner at the time. She sat in the passenger seat like usual, kept her hand over mine on the stick shift. I told her I loved her, how happy she made me. And then I thanked her. Thank you for letting me love you. I wanted to cry, but instead, I started laughing. Not because it was funny. I think I just didn't understand. And I never did. Mind you, this was all preceding my undergraduate years. And as I entered my freshman year, my condition seemed to shift from external losses to then alienation. You see, before college, I sought with everything in me to provide meaning and narrative reasons to the misfortunes of my life. To once again, understand it all. This is perhaps the greatest gift and simultaneous delusion of the creative writer. Believing as though we're so uniquely perceptive as to the nature of what it is to live and to struggle, such that we can in fact engineer and ascribe some meaningful essence to things. To craft, story, pinpoint, and coordinate some solidarity. It's implicit to all, but simply made explicit and conscious by the creative writer. From a draft of McAdams. Personal identity is the internalized and evolving life story that each of us is working on as we move through our adult lives. I do not really know who I am until I have a good understanding of my narrative identity. And so the absurd reality I came to know in my silent hours, unanswered prayers, and unfinished drafts was that although I'd been endowed with the perception and ingenuity for language and thought, my life, as I wanted to perceive it, couldn't reflect the coherence of a page. And this was, in a word, devastating. Now, Albert Camus, one of my favorite French writers and kind of quasi-philosophers, begins this issue of existentialism with exactly this. Responding to the sort of pinnacle conclusion of Nietzsche, God is dead and we have killed him, Camus begins there and asks, given that, this absurd meaninglessness, what should we do or can we do with life? The absurd in Camus' phrasing isn't just life is meaningless, it's that alienation. The collision between the universe's silence and our deep craving for transcendent telos, a predefined purpose. This is in many respects where my college career began. Alienation, to the extent that so overwhelming was the silence I experienced in Austin, Texas, that I decided to move back home. Only I didn't consider that I'd go on to carry this burdensome disposition. And from that personal statement later on, I spent most of my time running on the treadmill, listening to music, daydreaming, trying to make sense of it all. I still haven't. When confronted with the absurd, Camus sees three options. Nihilism, of course, concedes utter defeat. And a true nihilist, by definition, submits that nothing at all matters. This was actually a characterization I found rather compelling, and an intriguing archetype to explore in some of my creative writing works over the last semester. And from an excerpt of my final piece in my speculative fiction course. Coming inside, I kicked my shoes off at the door, then dumped what stash of letters I'd brought in onto the near coffee table. Coincidentally, the first one I sliced open happened to be of some importance, at least nominally. It seemed I was being called for jury duty, and it was this request, this legal demand for my moral input, my judgment of another's life, that I decided to end my own. Beyond the sheer inconvenience of maneuvering around my employment duties, I found this legal demand a bit insulting. I don't like courtrooms. I don't like lawyers, I thought. And I certainly don't believe that my judgment or the call of a single judge has any meaningful authority on what should or shouldn't be in another's life. I simply didn't want to go. And I saw no point in sticking around to reason with the contempt for my disobedience. A part of me thought to take down the Christmas lights, or maybe filter through any additional letters that I ought to consider before ending it all. But truly, what did it matter? Like Camus, I've been deeply unsatisfied with such a cynical framework. Another option posed when faced with the absurd is philosophical concession, retreating into illusions of transcendence or divinity. And while I have much appreciation and respect for this framework, I also struggle to find content here in the submission to a divine authority, or as Christopher Hitchens so colorfully puts it, a celestial North Korea. Though if I did, the past 22 years living with my dear almighty Belinda would have been excellent preparation for such subjugation. The path ultimately put forth by Camus, and need I stress this is not a wholly conclusive thought, but a gradual formula, is living in accordance with the absurd, with full consciousness of meaninglessness, but without despair. This is not to say create your own meaning necessarily, nor is it a form of delusion and or some serene resignation, but instead a form of revolt, an energetic and active rebellion. The absurd man, the hopeless rebel. Camus' absurdist philosophy isn't an absolute framework for life, once again. It is merely one of the many gradual logics to assess one's existence. In fact, one of the true pleasures of being his reader is to trace Camus' own objections and struggles with this philosophy throughout his later writings. There's much to critique and much left to be desired. But I've outlined the basic tenets of absurdism not because it has given me complete contempt and understanding for my life as I once wished to achieve, but because of the momentary beauty and intellectual freedom and the consciousness I've found in this study, as well as many philosophies to which my education has exposed me, at least for the time being. The myth of Sisyphus, the culmination, the crescendo of Camus' absurd illustration. This classic tale is how I'd like to articulate what my years in college have instilled in me, and what I seek to pursue going forward in my years as an academic, a philosopher, and yes, a storyteller, delusions and all. Most people know the image: a man pushing a boulder up a hill, watches it roll back down, and repeats the cycle forever. For context, Sisyphus is a figure not of resignation, but one of loving life to an aggressive degree. His entire life is an example of that absurd heroism. The tale of Sisyphus' earthly existence famously involves him fooling death in a myriad ways, thumbing his nose at the gods in the process. But jumping to the infamous sequence of Sisyphus' punishment, try saying that 5 times fast and you'll know how many times I had to practice that. For his crimes against the gods and against death, Sisyphus is condemned to that notorious cycle, rolling that boulder for all eternity. In many traditional representations, Sisyphus is depicted as tragic and strictly foolish. Homer writes, "And I saw Sisyphus in violent torment, seeking to raise a monstrous stone with both his hands. He will ever strive with hands and feet to heave the stone up to the crest of a hill. But just when he was about to heave it over the top, then would the weight turn it back." For many, this image has become a kind of cultural shorthand, flattened coffee mug wisdom about perseverance or the quiet dignity of feudal labor. But this popular reception tends to fixate on the wrong moment. What gets lost, and what Camus himself insists, and what I believe to be the real locus of this story, is the descent. Not the pushing, not the falling boulder, but the pause at the bottom, the walk back down, and the flicker of consciousness that attends to it. Camus writes, and here I really can't express the beauty of this language enough. It is during that return, that pause, that Sisyphus interests me. A face that toils so close to stones, it is already stone itself. I see that man going back down with a heavy yet measured step toward the torment of which he will never know the end. That hour, like a breathing space which returns as surely as his suffering. That is the hour of consciousness. At each of those moments, when he leaves the heights and gradually sinks towards the layers of the gods, he is superior to his fate. He is stronger than his rock. If this myth is tragic, that is because its hero is conscious. This descent is a truly crucial moment. When Sisyphus walks back down the hill briefly without strain or labor, he is at this interval free to think. And what he thinks about is his own absurd condition. He sees the boulder at the bottom of the hill and knows without qualification that it will never stay at the top. He knows that no god will relent. No hidden purpose to the punishment, no redemption waiting at some unspecified future point. And it is precisely this knowledge, his refusal to look away, that we can identify as the source of Sisyphus' strange joy. Camus' final words: "I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burden again." But Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes all is well. This universe henceforth, without a master, seems him neither futile nor sterile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain, in itself forms a world. The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. It is not enough to say that Sisyphus pushes that boulder and that we should admire his persistence. The real philosophical work happens when he stops the pushing. When he turns around, looks down at the hill, and walks back to the bottom with full awareness of what awaits him. I myself, in accordance with the concluding slogan of Camus' essay, I like to view Sisyphus turning towards his rock with a slight ironic grin, hopelessly content to rebel against and revel in his fate. For the past 4 years, I felt as though I've been struggling to walk down that hill. Accept the absurdity that is my life's incoherence, come to admire the beautiful irony of my world. Understand that foregoing the necessity to arbitrate and resolve concrete meaning is perhaps the paradox of what it is to learn, the catharsis that is imbued in the human experience. I now hearken to another now revised personal statement draft of mine, the version being the one selected by the admissions committee at Columbia. I'm often pestered by friends and family at nearly every routine holiday gathering as to why I'm gunning for graduate school, or even the point of an English major. I don't feel so obliged to justify my reasons to the extent that they'll appreciate, but if I did, I suppose I'd start with Macy, a young boy and his dog. I'd start with heartbreak, with laughter. I'd start with a child stuffing his blanket in a freezer to make it cold. I'd start with a mother's love, so impassioned and authentic that it would shout and scream under the weight of life's pressure. I would start with silence and boredom, with friendship, with hatred and with fear. I'd start with an indifference to a strange new reality that perhaps can never be reasoned or understood. I'd start with consciousness. I would start with education. I would start with the moments of cold brew hard copy PDFs at a Norton anthology wherein I step along the beautiful bloody dance between language, philosophy, and the ugliness of humanity, the dance that takes us both beyond and within ourselves. In conclusion, I ask that you leave me at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burden again. I too conclude that all is well. This universe henceforth without a master seems to me neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of my pen, each mineral flake of this night-filled room, in itself forms a world. The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a young boy's heart. Friends, family, Mom, one must imagine Mark Russell